They told Africa one truth, again and again. Challenge the West and you will not live to tell the story. Patrice Lumumba lasted just 67 days before he was silenced. Thomas Sankara was shot down in his own office. And when Muammar Gaddafi dared to imagine a pan-African currency, the world watched his brutal death streamed like a warning. Into this dangerous script walks Captain Ibrahim Traoré. At only 34, he did the unthinkable. He toppled a government, expelled French troops, and promised to return power to his people. His name now echoes in African streets and in Western war rooms. The story of how a young captain from a modest background in Burkina Faso became the youngest head of state in the world is more than politics. It is the collision of hope and fear, of independence long promised but never delivered. And it begins far from the presidential palace, in the dusty northern provinces, where Traoré once served as a junior officer. In those years, Burkina Faso was a nation trapped between its colonial past and an uncertain future. Foreign soldiers patrolled the land, but their priorities seemed misplaced. Ibrahim and his comrades saw French convoys guarding gold mines, while villages just a few miles away burned under terrorist attacks. They watched intelligence reports flow to Paris before reaching local commanders. They saw the logic of empire dressed up as cooperation agreements. To a young officer who believed his duty was to protect his people, the betrayal cut deep. The numbers told the same story. By 2020, Burkina Faso was producing more than 60 tons of gold each year, yet remained near the bottom of the United Nations Human Development Index. Life expectancy was barely above 60. Clean water reached just over a third of the population. For the soldiers in the field, these statistics were not abstract. They were the faces of displaced families, the empty schools, abandoned by fleeing teachers, the malnourished children in camps. By 2015, jihadist groups armed with weapons smuggled from Libya were striking across the Sahel. Burkina Faso suffered one of its deadliest attacks in 2016 when gunmen stormed the splendid hotel in the capital, killing 30 people. From that moment, the spiral deepened. Markets, schools, mosques, every corner of daily life became a potential target. Regions of the north and east became ungovernable. Local chiefs lost their authority. The government in Ouagadougou seemed powerless, or worse, uninterested. When Ibrahim Traoré rose to the rank of captain, he was sent directly into this chaos. He led men into villages, already half-emptied by fear. He buried comrades killed on patrol. He watched foreign advisors dictate battle plans that had little to do with saving Burkinabe lives. For him, the question was no longer military, but moral. Whose country was this? If its fate was decided in foreign capitals, the elected president, Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, he had promised reform when he came to power in 2015. Instead, he followed the international playbook, accepting aid, praising donors, and leaning on external partners. But the killings grew worse. By 2021, the protests in Ouagadougou filled the streets with chants, demanding his resignation. Soldiers at the front felt abandoned. Citizens felt betrayed. And into that rising tide of anger stepped Traoré's generation, young officers, unwilling to repeat the compromises of their elders. The breaking point came in January 2022, when Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba staged a coup against Kabore. For a moment, there was hope. Soldiers celebrated, crowds cheered, but within months it became clear nothing had changed. Damiba, too, leaned on Paris, too cautious to sever the old strings of dependency. To Traoré, it felt like déjà vu. Another leader, another uniform, but the same submission. By September 2022, the captain's patience had run out. At a security briefing, he watched Damiba defer to French advisors over the defense of Burkinabe territory. In that instant, Traoré realized the obvious truth. Faces can change, uniforms can change, but as long as the puppet strings remain, the play will never end. That night, he gathered the young officers he trusted most. They spoke not only of their anger but of their losses: friends killed, villages abandoned, promises betrayed. What began as whispers of frustration hardened into a decision. If no one else would cut the strings, they would. And so, before dawn on the 30th of September, shots rang out in the capital. Smoke curled above the presidential palace, and a name unknown to most of the world the day before was broadcast across every television in Africa. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is now the head of state. The morning after the gunfire, Burkina Faso woke to a different reality. Crowds surged into the streets of Ouagadougou, waving flags, chanting songs of resistance. Many were stunned at how quickly power had shifted. Others whispered that perhaps this was the moment their nation had been waiting for. The coup was not bloodless, but it was swift, surgical, and executed by men who claimed they had no choice left. At the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, 34 years old, soft-spoken in private, commanding on the parade ground, now declared the youngest head of state in the world. In his first appearance on national television, Traoré did not speak to Paris, Brussels, or Washington. He spoke directly to his people. "We will take back our dignity," he said, his voice firm, his eyes steady. Burkina Faso belongs to its citizens, not to foreign masters. For a country weary of leaders who bowed politely to ambassadors before listening to their own citizens, the words hit like thunder. The symbolism mattered. Previous rulers had rushed to reassure Western capitals after seizing power. Traoré reversed the script. Instead of calming investors, he calmed farmers. Instead of promising stability to diplomats, he promised security to mothers who had lost children to extremist violence. Within days, he began dismantling the old illusions. The most dramatic step came in December 2022, when Traoré formally requested the withdrawal of French troops. For decades, their presence had been justified as a shield against terrorism. But to many Burkinabe, the bases felt more like fortresses, protecting foreign economic interests than their own lives. By expelling them, Traoré declared that Burkina Faso's security would no longer be outsourced. For Paris, it was humiliation. For ordinary citizens, it was vindication. But the expulsion was not only symbolic, it created a void. French forces had advanced technology, surveillance networks, and logistics the Burkinabe army could not easily replace. Critics warned that pushing them out would leave the country exposed. Traoré countered that true sovereignty could never grow in someone else's shadow. He promised that partnerships would be rebuilt, but only with those who respected Burkina Faso's independence. True to his word, he began reaching out beyond the traditional circles. Russian advisors arrived quietly in Ouagadougou to provide training and weapons. Chinese firms won contracts to build roads and energy projects. Even Iranian specialists were invited to share agricultural expertise. "We are open to all nations," Traoré insisted, "as long as they come in respect, not in domination." For Western officials, it was a dangerous pivot. For his supporters, it was proof that the old colonial monopoly was finally cracking. The reaction abroad was immediate. European think tanks published alarmed reports warning of authoritarian backsliding. American diplomats fretted in private about a domino effect across the Sahel. News outlets in Paris framed Traoré as a reckless populist who had no real plan beyond fiery speeches. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, his portrait appeared on murals. Market women spoke of him as "our son." Young men in the displaced camps, many of them jobless, began to chant his name as a symbol of resistance. Still, challenges mounted. The insurgency did not pause to applaud the revolution. Attacks in the north and east continued. Families kept fleeing their homes. 2 million Burkinabe were displaced by 2024, nearly 1 in 10 of the population. For every rally where Traoré promised a rebirth, there were funerals reminding citizens of the fragile reality. Inside the presidential compound, the new leader faced the impossible balance between vision and survival. Expelling foreign troops had raised national pride, but it also strained the army's capacity. Relying on new partners like Russia or Iran was politically powerful, but logistically slow. Meanwhile, the economy still depended heavily on gold exports, most of which left the country raw, unprocessed, and undervalued. Traoré vowed to change that, to build factories that would refine resources inside Burkina Faso. But those plans required time and money. In the cafes of the capital, debates flared. Was the captain a liberator or a dreamer? Could a man in his 30s carry the weight of generations? Elders remembered Sankara and Lumumba, heroes cut down in their prime. Youths dismissed the doubts, arguing that history only changes when someone dares to try. Internationally, the pressure mounted. Aid was cut. Sanction loomed. Western media kept replaying one headline: Traoré extends military rule until 2029. Few explained why he insisted on such a long transition. To his critics, it looked like a power grab. To his supporters, it was common sense. You cannot rebuild a house while the foundation is shaking, he told a gathering in early 2023. We will return to civilian rule only when our institutions can stand without foreign crutches. That argument resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta echoed similar themes of sovereignty. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani began questioning uranium deals with France. Suddenly, Traoré's coup looked less like an isolated storm and more like the first wave of a regional tide. By the end of his first year in power, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had achieved something rare in African politics. He had shifted the conversation. No longer was Burkina Faso spoken of only as a victim of poverty and terror. It was now a symbol of defiance. Whether that defiance would lead to renewal or ruin was still uncertain. But across Africa, a new chant was rising. From Bamako to Niamey to Ouagadougou, we will decide our own destiny. By the second year of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rule, it became clear that the story unfolding in Burkina Faso was no longer confined to its borders. What began as a coup in a small, landlocked nation was rapidly becoming a continental awakening. From Mali to Niger, from Senegal to Kenya, young Africans were tuning into his speeches, sharing his words on social media, and repeating his defiant slogans in crowded marketplaces. For the first time in decades, Africa's youth felt they had a leader who spoke their language of pride and independence. The momentum crystallized in early 2023, when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced the alliance of Sahel states. On paper, it was a pact of military cooperation. In practice, it was a declaration of shared defiance. Intelligence would be shared, joint patrols organized, and borders defended together. But the symbolism ran deeper. Three nations that had suffered coups, international sanctions, and endless lectures from foreign ambassadors were now charting their own course side by side. Western diplomats called it reckless. African youth called it liberation. For once, our leaders are saying no, and meaning it, said a university student in Bamako, his face lit up by the glow of a smartphone replaying Traoré's speech. We are tired of being treated like children. The regional shift sent shockwaves through established institutions. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, long aligned with Western interests, threatened sanctions and suspension. In response, the alliance moved even faster, openly discussing withdrawal from ECOWAS entirely. For older generations accustomed to compromise, the idea sounded dangerous. For the young, it sounded intoxicating. In Ouagadougou, murals of Traoré appeared beside portraits of Sankara, blending past and present into a single visual message. Resistance has returned. Musicians wrote songs about the captain of the people. In Niger, protesters waved both Burkinabe and Malian flags, chanting slogans of solidarity. The feeling was contagious. Borders that once divided now became lines of unity against perceived colonial manipulation. The West watched with growing unease. Reports circulated in European think tanks, warning of a contagion effect. American officials spoke in private of the need to contain the narrative before it spreads. International media began to sharpen their portrayal of Traoré. No longer framed as a young revolutionary, he was increasingly labeled as a strongman, a populist, or an authoritarian. Stories dwelled on press restrictions, on displaced families, on the extension of military rule to 2029 without context. Without history, the narrative was clear. Discredit the man before the movement grows too large. But the more the criticisms poured in, the more his support seemed to harden. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta adopted Traoré's language of sovereignty. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani questioned uranium contracts that had long enriched French companies while leaving Nigerian villages in the dark. Across the Sahel, ordinary citizens saw the backlash from Europe as proof that their leaders were finally hitting the right nerve. Traoré himself leaned into the symbolism. In rallies, he invoked the names of African ancestors, reminding his people that their history did not begin with colonization. Our forefathers built kingdoms, empires, civilizations long before Europe knew our names, he declared in one fiery speech. If they could do it then, we can do it now. His voice, broadcast over radio waves and WhatsApp groups, resonated across borders in ways Western press releases could not. Yet beneath the applause, the challenges were immense. Security in Burkina Faso was deteriorating. Attacks by militants had risen, and large swathes of the countryside remained out of government control. Critics at home accused Traoré of using Pan-African rhetoric to mask local failures. Even among his supporters, whispers grew. Could the captain's vision outpace his country's reality? Still, for millions of Africans, the vision itself mattered. They had spent their lives watching leaders bow to donors, accept aid with strings attached, and allow resources to flow north while their people remained poor. Traoré's defiance, even if imperfect, gave them something to believe in. In international forums, his envoys rejected the usual scripts. When Western diplomats spoke of stability, they countered with sovereignty. When aid was offered with conditions, they called it economic terrorism. This refusal to play by the rules electrified supporters and terrified opponents. By late 2023, the phrase Alliance of Sahel States was being whispered not just in West Africa but across the continent. Activists in Kenya, students in South Africa, farmers in Ghana, all saw in Traoré's defiance a mirror of their own frustrations. The young captain, once obscure even in his own country, had become the face of a wider continental movement. And for the West, the nightmare was not just Traoré himself, but the possibility that his voice might inspire millions of others to stop whispering and start shouting. The West had seen this play before. Whenever an African leader spoke too boldly of sovereignty, the response was swift. Pressure, isolation, and if necessary, punishment. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was no exception. By late 2023, The young leader found himself at the center of an international campaign to cut him down to size. The first blow came through economics. The European Union announced targeted sanctions against officials in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, freezing assets, restricting trade, and suspending development aid. The justification was wrapped in the language of democracy and human rights. But to many Africans, it felt like the same old message: obey or suffer. For a country already battling poverty and displacement, the sanctions were not just lines in a policy document. They were food prices rising in markets, medicines disappearing from clinics, and construction projects grinding to a halt. In Ouagadougou, Traoré did not flinch. Standing before a sea of supporters, he declared, "These sanctions are economic terrorism. They are not meant to protect democracy. They are meant to keep us on our knees." His words ignited cheers from the crowd. But behind the scenes, his ministers scrambled to stabilize fuel supplies and secure alternative trade routes. The cost of defiance was becoming tangible. The second front was diplomacy. Western ambassadors toured African capitals, warning of authoritarian drift in Burkina Faso. ECOWAS, once a regional forum, now sounded like an enforcer for outside powers, threatening further embargoes. In New York and Geneva, international organizations published reports questioning press freedom, election delays, and the treatment of displaced people. The irony was not lost on Burkina Faso. The same powers that had ignored decades of exploitation were now suddenly alarmed about governance. But perhaps the most sophisticated attack came through the media. Major outlets in Europe and America began to reshape the narrative. No longer was Traoré introduced as Africa's youngest head of state. He was framed as a strongman, another military ruler clinging to power. Headlines focused obsessively on the extension of military rule until 2029, rarely explaining why. Stories highlighted insecurity and hardship, but seldom the decades of foreign interference that had fueled them. To the Western audience, Traoré was becoming just another face in Africa's endless cycle of instability. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the propaganda often backfired. Each foreign condemnation seemed to reinforce Traoré's claim that he was challenging a system designed to keep Africa submissive. If they hate him this much, one market trader said, then he must be doing something right. Approval ratings at home remained high. In Mali and Niger, posters of Traoré appeared at rallies. His image carried alongside slogans of unity and resistance. Yet no amount of rhetoric could erase the hardship. By 2024, more than 2 million Burkinabe had been displaced by conflict. Schools stayed closed in the north, clinics shut their doors, and entire districts slipped beyond government control. Militants struck with increasing confidence. Traoré's decision to expel French forces had raised national pride. But the promised replacements, Russian trainers, Chinese engineers, Iranian agricultural specialists, were slow to fill the gaps. Families in rural camps cared little for speeches. They needed safety and bread. The contradictions grew sharper. How could Burkina Faso claim independence while leaning on Moscow or Tehran? How could Traoré promise dignity when young professionals were leaving the country in droves, searching for jobs in safer, more stable nations? Even his supporters admitted the revolution was a hard road. But for them, hardship was the price of breaking chains. Revolution is never easy. Traoré reminded his people, if it were, others would have done it before us. Meanwhile, Western capitals whispered about containment. Could they prevent the Traoré effect from spreading to larger states like Nigeria or Ghana? Could they discredit him before his defiance became a model? Aid agencies were instructed to limit cooperation. Loans from international banks dried up. Travel restrictions tightened. In private, some European analysts admitted the real fear, not that Traoré would fail, but that he might succeed. By mid-2024, the battle lines were clear. On one side stood a young captain promising to reclaim sovereignty, backed by millions of Africans who felt their dignity long denied. On the other side stood the guardians of an old order, armed with sanctions, headlines, and diplomacy. The clash was more than political. It was generational, even civilizational, and as the pressure mounted, a question hung in the air. Would Traoré bend under the weight of isolation, or would he turn the sanctions meant to weaken him into the very fire that kept his revolution alive? Revolutions are rarely tidy. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the slogans of sovereignty collided daily with the stubborn realities of a country under siege. In 2022, the number of Burkinabe killed in militant attacks stood at over 3,600. By 2024, the toll had nearly doubled, surpassing 6,000. Entire regions of the north and east remained outside government control. Villages were emptied, markets silenced, roads patrolled not by police but by armed groups. The withdrawal of French troops had been a proud moment of independence, but it also left dangerous gaps. Russian advisors arrived. Yes, But training soldiers and delivering equipment could not be done overnight. Intelligence networks that once relied on French satellites and drones were gone. Burkinabe forces, courageous but under-equipped, often fought blind against enemies who struck fast and melted away. Every funeral of a young soldier carried the same bitter question: was pride worth this price? For displaced families, the hardships were relentless. By 2024, more than 2 million people, nearly 1 in 10 citizens, had fled their homes. Camps on the outskirts of Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso overflowed with women and children. Schools shut their doors, clinics ran out of supplies. Humanitarian organizations warned of malnutrition and disease. In speeches, Traoré called the suffering the necessary pain of breaking free. But for mothers trying to feed their children, ideals were no substitute for bread. The economic front offered little relief. Gold remained the country's lifeline, accounting for the majority of export revenues. Yet the very model Traoré condemned, shipping raw materials north, leaving his people poor, was still in place. Efforts to build refining plants and processing facilities were announced, but progress was slow. Roads to the mines were insecure, investors wary, and sanctions cut off access to vital capital. The paradox was cruel. In a land glittering with gold, millions lived on the edge of hunger. Agriculture, too, struggled. Ambitious programs to boost self-sufficiency clashed with the realities of climate change, poor irrigation, and recurring insecurity. Farmers could not till land when armed groups prowled the fields. Traders could not reach markets when highways became ambush zones. Traoré's partnerships with Iran and China promised expertise and technology, but implementation lagged behind promises. Meanwhile, the youth of Burkina Faso, the very generation that had carried Traoré to power, with chants of defiance, faced a grim horizon. Unemployment remained stubbornly high. Factories were few, offices scarcer still. For skilled graduates, the temptation to leave became irresistible. Ghana, Ivory Coast, and Senegal offered safer streets and better wages. The brain drain was subtle at first, then unmistakable. Each departure meant one less doctor, one less engineer, one less teacher for the future. Traoré was trying to build Bursins. Even loyal supporters began to voice unease. Could true sovereignty exist if survival depended on Moscow's weapons or Beijing's roads? Was breaking with Paris only to lean on other powers a genuine revolution, or simply a new dependency with different masters? Traoré did not deny the contradictions. Instead, he reframed them as the unavoidable growing pains of liberation. You cannot expect the chains of a century to fall without scars, he told a rally in 2024. We are bleeding, yes, but we bleed because we are cutting ourselves free. To his critics, it sounded like excuse-making. To his followers, it was proof of authenticity. They argued that hardship was not a sign of failure but of courage, proof that their leader was truly shaking the foundations of a broken system. If it were easy, one farmer said in an interview, the others before him would have done it. He is suffering with us, not above us. The decision to extend the transition until 2029 became part of this logic. Western headlines called it a blatant power grab. Inside Burkina Faso, many saw it differently. Elections held too soon, Traoré argued, would only recycle the same elites who had failed the nation for decades. You cannot build a house while the foundation is shaking, he told the nation. The metaphor stuck, repeated in markets and mosques alike. For many, patience was not submission. It was survival. But patience had limits. Every month brought new attacks, new funerals, new economic struggles. The revolution promised dignity, yet daily life demanded bread. For the young captain, the question was becoming sharper. I could vision alone keep a nation afloat, or would the harsh arithmetic of war and poverty prove stronger than his words? If Captain Ibrahim Traoré delivers security, prosperity, and sovereignty together, he will prove that Africa can break free from its old chains. If he falters, he risks confirming the very stereotypes he set out to destroy. For Burkina Faso, and for the continent, it is more than politics. It is a wager on dignity itself. The revolution is unfolding in real time, and the question remains, will Traoré's defiance mark the birth of a new era, or the burial of a generation's dream?